Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. In the shadows of ancient Babylon, where brick walls rose high against the desert sky and the sounds of civilization echoed through narrow streets, there lived two souls whose names would become eternal symbols of love and tragedy. This is not just another tale of young romance gone wrong. This is the story that would inspire countless others, that would plant the seeds for Shakespeare's most famous tragedy, and that would forever transform a simple tree into a monument of sacrifice and devotion. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let me take you back more than 2,000 years, to a time when the world was still young, and stories were told not through books or screens, but through the voices of poets who understood that love and loss are two sides of the same coin. Close your eyes and imagine a city of wonders, a place where dreams and reality intertwined as intimately as the lives of our two young lovers. This is the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, and before we reach its heartbreaking conclusion, you'll understand why it has endured for millennia. The magnificent city of Babylon. Let us begin where all great stories must, with the setting itself. Babylon was not merely a city. It was a legend made manifest in brick and mortar, a testament to human ambition and ingenuity that rose from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia like a mirage that refused to fade. The Roman poet Ovid, who would immortalize our lovers in his masterwork Metamorphoses, described Babylon as the city where first her queen, for state, raised walls of brick magnificently great. This queen was Semiramis, a figure shrouded in as much legend as historical fact. The Semiramis of myth and poetry was credited by ancient writers with founding Babylon and constructing the mighty walls that encircled the city, walls so thick that chariots could race along their tops, walls that some ancient writers numbered among the 7 wonders of the world. In reality, Semiramis appears to have been based on the historical Assyrian queen Sammu Rammat, who ruled as regent from around 811 to 806 BC. But by Ovid's time, history and legend had become thoroughly intertwined, and Semiramis had been transformed into a semi-divine warrior queen, credited with achievements far beyond what the historical Sammu Rammat actually accomplished. The Babylon that Ovid describes in his poetry, whether fully historical or partly legendary, was a city of magnificent walls, These great fortifications, actually built by King Nebuchadnezzar II during his reign from 604 to 562 BC, were architectural marvels constructed from millions of baked bricks. The walls stretched for miles, punctuated by massive gates adorned with glazed tiles depicting dragons and bulls, symbols of the gods who supposedly protected the city and its inhabitants. Within these walls, life pulsed with an energy that few cities of the ancient world could match. The streets, though, narrow by our standards, teemed with merchants from distant lands, their stalls overflowing with spices from the east, textiles from Egypt, and metalwork from regions whose names have been lost to time. The air was thick with the mingled scents of cooking fires, incense from the temples, and the dust that seemed to be an eternal companion in this desert realm. The sound of haggling voices rose and fell like waves, punctuated by the braying of donkeys, the clatter of cartwheels on stone, and occasionally the solemn chanting of priests making their way to the great ziggurat that dominated the city's skyline. These two houses shared a common wall, a single barrier of brick and mortar that had been constructed years before when both properties were built as part of the same development. The families who occupied them were prosperous, though not wealthy beyond measure. They were merchants, perhaps, or skilled craftsmen, whose work was valued enough to provide comfortable, if not luxurious, lives for their children. On the surface, these families should have been natural allies, their proximity encouraging friendship and mutual support. But this was not to be. Between these two households, there existed a rivalry so old that no one could quite remember how it had started. Perhaps it had begun with a business dispute, a deal gone wrong, accusations of cheating or dishonesty that could never be proven or disproven. Or maybe it was something more personal, an insult delivered or perceived, a slight that festered and grew over the years until it became an unbridgeable chasm of pride and stubbornness. The original cause had long since faded into irrelevance, but the enmity remained, passed down from generation to generation, like a precious but poisonous heirloom. The fathers of these households forbade their children from having any contact with the neighbors. To speak to them would be a betrayal. To acknowledge them with even a nod would be to dishonor the family name. And certainly, absolutely certainly, there could be no thought of friendship, and heaven forbid, no consideration of anything deeper. The children of these families were raised from birth to view their neighbors with suspicion and disdain, even though they lived separated by nothing more than a wall of bricks. But hatred, as powerful as it can be, is not the strongest force in the human heart. And in these two houses, on opposite sides of that divisive wall, grew two children who would prove that love can flourish even in the most inhospitable soil, even when watered by tears and nourished by nothing but stolen moments and whispered words. The birth of love in the shadow of hatred. Pyramus was born on a spring evening when the desert air had finally cooled after another scorching day. His first cries were strong and healthy, and his parents rejoiced at having a son who would carry on the family name and business. He grew into his childhood with the ease of a well-loved boy, his parents doting on him while also instilling in him the values they held dear: honor, loyalty to family, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining the boundaries that separated them from the family next door. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily handsome. Ovid would later describe him as the most beautiful young man in all the East, and while poets are known for hyperbole, there must have been truth in the description. His features were regular and pleasing, his bearing confident without arrogance, his movements graceful in the way of the naturally athletic. His eyes held intelligence and curiosity, and his smile, when it appeared, could light up the dimmest room. On the other side of that wall, perhaps only weeks before or after Pyramus's birth, another child entered the world. Thisbe's arrival was greeted with equal joy, for though sons were prized in that society, daughters were loved and cherished. She was a beautiful baby who grew into an even more beautiful child, and then young woman. Her hair was dark and lustrous, her features delicate yet strong, her movements possessed of an unconscious grace that made even simple tasks seem like a dance. But more than her physical beauty, Thisbe possessed qualities that were rarer and more valuable: intelligence, compassion, courage, and a heart capable of deep and abiding love. These two children grew up separated by less than the width of an arm. The wall that divided their homes was perhaps 18 inches thick at most, constructed in that ancient manner where mud bricks were laid and then plastered over. They could have been friends from infancy. In a different world, without the burden of their family's meaningless feud, they might have played together as toddlers, learned together as children, and grown into young adulthood as companions who knew each other as well as they knew themselves. But that was not their fate. Instead, they grew up in enforced isolation, each aware of the other's existence only through the sounds that penetrated that wall. Pyramus heard Thisbe's laughter floating through from the neighboring courtyard, a sound so pure and joyful that it made him smile even when he didn't know why. Thisbe heard Pyramus's voice as he practiced the business negotiations he would one day need to conduct, his tone serious and measured. And she found herself imagining what kind of man possessed such a voice. As they grew older, these accidental moments of auditory connection became more frequent and more charged with meaning. The wall between their houses was old, and like all old things, it had developed imperfections over the years. The seasonal expansion and contraction caused by the desert's extreme temperature variations, the settling of foundations, the simple passage of time. All of these had worked on the mortar and bricks until tiny cracks had formed. Most were invisible, barely large enough for air to pass through. But there was one crack, one flaw that the original builders had somehow missed, and that no one had noticed or thought to repair, that ran from near the base of the wall upward for several feet. It was Thisbe who discovered this crack first. She was perhaps 14 or 15 years old, an age when curiosity battles with caution and usually wins. She had been in one of the rooms that backed onto the shared wall, a storage space where her family kept grain and other staples. The room was dim, lit only by the weak light that filtered through the high window. And in that dimness, she noticed something strange. There was a thin line of brighter light coming from the wall itself, a narrow beam that seemed impossibly out of place. She approached cautiously, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite name. When she reached the wall, she discovered the crack, narrow but distinct, running vertically through the plaster and the brick beneath. It was perhaps as wide as her smallest finger, maybe slightly less. But when she put her eye close to it, she could see through to the other side. There was another room there, also dim, also used for storage. But it was a room in the forbidden house, a space she had been told her entire life was off limits, dangerous, enemy territory. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stood there, one eye pressed to the crack, seeing for the first time into the world that existed just beyond her own. There was nothing remarkable about what she saw, just a similar storage room with similar provisions. But the transgression of looking, of seeing what was forbidden, sent a thrill through her that was part fear and part exhilaration. She didn't know that on the other side of that same wall, in another part of the house, Pyramus had made a similar discovery. He had found the crack from his side, had pressed his own eye to it, had felt that same mixture of fear and excitement at breaching the unspoken boundary between the families. Fate has a way of bringing destined souls together. And so, it was perhaps inevitable that one day both of them would be near that crack at the same time. Pyramus had come to the storage room to retrieve something for his father. Thisbe had been sent on a similar errand. Both were thinking their own private thoughts. Both were alone, and both were drawn to that crack in the wall as if by an invisible thread. Pyramus approached first, drawn by that curiosity that had never quite left him since he'd first discovered the flaw. He bent down to peer through, and as he did, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. There was an eye looking back at him. Not just any eye, but one so beautiful, so luminous, that for a moment he forgot to breathe. Thisbe, for her part, had been frozen in place when she saw the eye appear on the other side. But the shock quickly gave way to something else. There was no threat in that gaze, no hostility. Instead, she saw surprise that mirrored her own, and something else, something warm and curious and entirely unexpected. Neither of them moved. They simply stood there, each with one eye pressed to that crack, looking at each other across the divide that was supposed to be impassable. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the universe. Two souls recognized each other across a barrier that should have kept them apart forever. Whispers through the wall. After that first meeting of eyes, Pyramus and Thisbe could not stay away from the crack in the wall. They found excuses to visit those storage rooms, timing their visits for moments when their families were occupied elsewhere, when the houses were quiet and the risk of discovery was minimal. At first, they did not speak. They simply looked at each other, those single eyes meeting across the narrow gap, communicating in ways that words could never achieve. But eventually, the temptation to speak became too strong to resist. Thisbe was the first to break the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, soft as silk, trembling slightly with the fear of being overheard. "Can you hear me?" 3 simple words, but they changed everything. On his side of the wall, Pyramus felt his heart leap into his throat. The eye he had been gazing at disappeared, replaced by the shadow of her face pressed close to the crack. He could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, with nervousness. "Yes," he breathed back, his mouth close to the opening. "I can hear you." And so began a courtship, unlike any other, conducted through a crack in a wall, in whispers barely loud enough to carry from one side to the other. They had to be so careful. If anyone heard them, if anyone discovered what they were doing, the consequences would be severe. The crack would be sealed, plastered over, made permanent and impassable. Worse, they might be punished, kept under such strict supervision that they would never have even this small connection again. So they spoke in hushed tones, their words careful and measured, each conversation a precious gift that might be their last. They learned about each other slowly, building a picture of who the other person was through these fragmentary exchanges. Pyramus told her about his dreams of traveling beyond Babylon, of seeing the great cities he had heard merchants describe, of understanding the wider world beyond the walls that enclosed their lives. He spoke of his love for poetry, a passion he had to hide from his father, who thought such things were frivolous and unmanly. He recited verses he had memorized, ancient poems about heroes and gods, and through the wall he heard Thisbe's delighted laughter, soft as rain. Thisbe shared her own dreams and fears. She spoke of her love for the stars, how she would climb to the roof on clear nights and try to map out the constellations, imagining what lay beyond them. She told him about the books she secretly read, scrolls borrowed from a kindly teacher who recognized her intelligence and encouraged her to learn, even though formal education for girls was not common. She confessed her fear that her parents would soon choose a husband for her, some merchant or tradesman she had never met, and that she would be expected to submit to a marriage without love. As these conversations continued over weeks and months, something inevitable happened. The attachment between them deepened from curiosity to friendship, and from friendship to something more profound. They fell in love through that crack in the wall, their hearts opening to each other in ways that defied the physical barrier between them. Pyramus found himself thinking of Thisbe constantly. Her voice had become the sweetest sound he knew, sweeter than music, more beautiful than bird song. He imagined her face, building a picture from that single eye and the shadow of her profile he sometimes glimpsed. At night, he lay awake, replaying their conversations, treasuring each word she had spoken, counting the hours until he might speak to her again. Thisbe felt the same overwhelming tide of emotion. She had never believed in the romantic poetry she had read, had thought it the foolish exaggeration of writers who knew nothing of real life. But now she understood. Every moment away from that wall was torture. Every hour spent in the company of others felt hollow and meaningless because they were not him. She memorized the sound of his voice, the cadence of his speech, the gentle way he spoke her name. They began to time their visits more precisely, developing signals that would tell the other when it was safe to come to the wall. A certain sound, a pattern of taps, a whispered call so soft that only the most attentive ear could catch it. Their meetings became a ritual, the high point of days that otherwise felt empty and purposeless. But with love came frustration. The more they felt for each other, the more unbearable that wall became. It was both their connection and their torment. Through it, they could speak, could share their hearts and minds, could create a bond that transcended the physical separation. But it also represented everything that stood between them: family pride, ancient grudges, social expectations that neither of them had any power to change. "I hate this wall," Pyramus whispered one evening, his voice rough with emotion. "I hate it for keeping us apart. But without it, we would never have been able to speak at all," Thisbe replied softly. "The crack in this wall is the only reason we found each other." "Then I am grateful to the wall for its flaw," Pyramus said, a trace of bitter humor in his voice. "I thank it for being imperfect, for being broken, because that brokenness let me know you." They both fell silent then, contemplating the strange paradox of their situation. The wall was both blessing and curse, both the cause of their suffering and the sole means of its relief. "There must be a way," Thisbe said after a long moment. "There must be some way for us to be together properly, not just like this, speaking through stone and brick, like prisoners. If there is, I will find it," Pyramus promised, his voice fierce with determination. "I swear to you, Thisbe, I will find a way for us to be together. Not like this, not in secret and shadow. I want to see your face in sunlight. I want to hold your hand. I want—" He stopped, overwhelmed by the intensity of his own emotions. On the other side of the wall, Thisbe pressed her palm flat against the brick, wishing she could feel his warmth through the cold, unyielding surface. "I want that too," she whispered. "More than anything." As the months passed and their meetings continued, a dangerous idea began to take root in both their minds. If their families would not relent, if the wall between them would always remain, then perhaps the only solution was to leave, to flee Babylon entirely, to go somewhere their family's ancient grudge had no power, somewhere they could be together openly, honestly, without shame or fear. It was a terrifying prospect. Neither of them had ever left the city. The world beyond Babylon's walls was unknown and potentially dangerous, filled with perils they could only imagine. They would be leaving behind everyone they knew, every comfort and security, venturing into uncertainty with nothing but each other. But as they whispered through that crack in the wall, as they planned and dreamed and promised. The idea became less frightening and more appealing. They would rather face an uncertain future together than continue living separate lives in the same place, so close yet impossibly far apart. The plan takes shape. The decision to flee was not made lightly. For several weeks after first broaching the idea, Pyramus and Thisbe argued with themselves and each other about whether it was truly the right choice. The risks were enormous. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. Their families might do more than simply separate them. They might take measures to ensure the young lovers never saw each other again. Perhaps even arranging immediate marriages to other people, binding them with chains stronger than any physical barrier. And even if they managed to escape Babylon undetected, what then? They would be two young people, barely more than children, really, alone in a world that could be cruel to the vulnerable. They had no family connections beyond the city, no guaranteed source of income or protection. They would be entirely dependent on each other, with no safety net if things went wrong. But against all these logical objections stood one overwhelming truth. They loved each other. And that love, once born, could not be denied or suppressed. It burned in their hearts like a flame that no amount of caution or common sense could extinguish. The more they tried to talk themselves out of it, the more certain they became that flight was their only option. "We need a plan," Pyramus said during one of their whispered conversations. "We cannot simply run blindly. We need to think this through carefully." Thisbe agreed. "We should meet outside the city, somewhere we can both reach safely. If we try to leave together, we might be seen. But if we go separately and meet at a predetermined place, we have a better chance." They began to plan in earnest, working out every detail they could think of. The timing would be crucial. They would need to leave at night when their families were asleep, when the streets of Babylon were mostly empty and the guards at the gates were less vigilant. There was a gate in the eastern wall that was known to be poorly maintained, where the guards often slept at their posts or abandoned them entirely to seek entertainment elsewhere. "But where do we go once we're outside?" Thisbe asked. "We cannot just wander in the darkness. We need a specific meeting place, somewhere we can find each other." Pyramus had been thinking about this. "There is a tomb outside the city walls, perhaps a half-hour's walk from the eastern gate. It was built for King Ninus, the legendary founder of Nineveh. You know the one I mean?" Thisbe did know it. The tomb of Ninus was famous throughout Babylon, a massive structure visible for miles across the flat desert landscape. It would be impossible to miss, even in darkness, especially with the moon to guide them. "Near the tomb, there is a tree," Pyramus continued, "a mulberry tree, quite large and old. It grows beside a spring, one of the few reliable water sources in that area. The tree should be easy to find." "A mulberry tree?" Thisbe repeated, fixing the image in her mind. "Yes, I think I know it. I saw it once when I was younger, on a journey with my father. It was magnificent, with white berries." "That's the one. We will meet there, beneath that tree. Whoever arrives first will wait for the other. And once we are together, we will continue eastward. There are cities in that direction, places where no one knows us or our families. We can make a new life there." The plan was simple, which was its greatest strength. Simple plans had fewer points where things could go wrong. They set a date, choosing a night 2 weeks hence when the moon would be nearly full, providing enough light to travel by while still affording some cover of darkness. "We cannot bring much with us," Pyramus warned. "Anything we take needs to fit in a small bag, something we can carry easily without attracting attention." Thisbe had already thought of this. "I will bring some jewelry my mother gave me. We can sell it if we need money. And I will take a warm cloak. The desert nights can be cold. I will bring what coins I can gather without arousing suspicion," Pyramus said. "And a knife for protection. Nothing else. We travel light and move fast." As the chosen night approached, both of them were consumed with nervous energy. They continued their regular routines, trying desperately not to do anything that might alert their families that something was amiss. Pyramus forced himself to focus on his father's business matters, nodding and agreeing to plans that would never involve him. Thisbe smiled and made pleasant conversation with her mother, discussing domestic matters that suddenly seemed to belong to another lifetime. At night, they would meet at their crack in the wall and reassure each other, going over the plan one more time, promising that they would both be there, that neither would fail the other. "I am frightened," Thisbe admitted 3 nights before their planned flight. "Not of leaving, but of the moment itself. What if something goes wrong? What if one of us cannot make it to the meeting place?" "Then we wait," Pyramus said firmly. "If I am delayed, you wait for me. If you are delayed, I will wait for you. We will not give up on each other, no matter what happens. Promise me, Thisbe, promise me that you will not give up." "I promise," she whispered back. "I will wait for you forever if I must. I would rather die than live without you." The words were spoken in the heightened emotion of the moment, a dramatic declaration born of young love and genuine fear. Neither of them realized how prophetic those words would prove to be. Neither of them could have imagined that forever would be measured in minutes, not years, and that death would indeed be the final chapter of their story. The night before their planned escape, Neither of them could sleep. Pyramus lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He had gathered his small collection of coins, wrapped them carefully in cloth to prevent them from clinking, and hidden them in the bag he would carry. He had sharpened his knife and tested its edge, hoping he would never need to use it, but knowing that the world beyond Babylon's walls could be dangerous. He had written no farewell note to his parents. It would only give them information that might help in pursuing the lovers. Better to simply disappear and let them wonder. In her own bed, on the other side of that eternal wall, Thisbe was equally sleepless. She had selected the jewelry carefully, choosing pieces that were valuable but not so precious that their absence would be immediately noticed. She had laid out her warmest cloak and the most practical clothes she owned, garments that would allow her to walk long distances without discomfort. Like Pyramus, she had written nothing, said nothing, given no hint of what was to come. Tomorrow night, when her family discovered her gone, there would be confusion and anger, and perhaps, eventually, grief. But by then, she would be far away, safe in the arms of the man she loved. As dawn broke over Babylon, painting the brick walls in shades of pink and gold, both of them rose and prepared for what they hoped would be their last day in the city of their birth. They went through the motions of normal life, eating breakfast with families they would never see again, speaking pleasantries that felt hollow and false. All day long, they waited for evening, for darkness, for the moment when they could finally begin their new life together. That evening, as the sun set and shadows lengthened across the city, Pyramus and Thisbe met one last time at their crack in the wall. "Tonight," Pyramus whispered, "are you ready?" "I am ready," Thisbe replied, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "I will be there, at the tomb, beneath the mulberry tree." "As will I," Pyramus promised. "Nothing will prevent me from meeting you there. Nothing in this world." "I love you," Thisbe said, the words flowing easily now, no longer strange or frightening, but simply true. "And I love you," Pyramus replied. "Until tonight, my love, until we are together at last." They parted then, each returning to their homes to wait for the household to fall asleep, to wait for the moment when they could slip away into the night and toward the destiny that awaited them beneath the mulberry tree. A journey into darkness. The city of Babylon settled into its nightly rhythms as the sun disappeared beyond the western horizon. Merchants closed their stalls and secured their goods. Families gathered for evening meals, the smell of cooking fires drifting through the streets. Gradually, The daytime bustle faded into a quieter atmosphere, though Babylon never truly slept. There were always some people awake, some activities continuing. Guards making their rounds, workers in the bakeries preparing tomorrow's bread, tavern customers drinking and gaming in dimly lit rooms. In two neighboring houses separated by that fateful wall, two young lovers pretended to follow their normal evening routines. They ate dinner with their families, participated in the usual conversations, gave no sign of the storm of emotions raging within them. As the hour grew late, each retired to their sleeping quarters, performing the nightly rituals that would, they hoped, lull their families into believing everything was as it should be. Thisbe lay in her bed, still fully dressed beneath the blankets, listening to the sounds of her household settling down for the night. She heard her father's heavy footsteps as he made his final rounds, checking that doors were locked and shutters secured. She heard her mother's softer tread as she moved between rooms, ensuring all was well before seeking her own rest. She heard the voices of servants murmuring in the back of the house, winding down their own day's work. She forced herself to lie still, to breathe slowly and evenly, to present the appearance of sleep should anyone check on her. But inside, her heart was racing, her mind spinning with anticipation and fear. She went over the plan again and again. Wait until the house is completely quiet. Slip out through the small door that led from the storage rooms to the back alley. Make her way through the darkened streets to the eastern gate. Pass through into the desert beyond, and find the tomb of Ninos with its distinctive mulberry tree. In his own bed, Pyramus was going through similar agonies of waiting. He had positioned his bag where he could grab it quickly, had memorized the route he would take through the house to avoid the rooms where family members slept. He had practiced the route several times during the day, timing how long it would take, identifying which floorboards creaked and which doors squeaked on their hinges. He had thought through every detail, planned for every contingency he could imagine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the house grew quiet. Pyramus waited even longer, forcing himself to count to 1,000 before he moved, ensuring that anyone who was still awake would have settled. Then, moving with painful slowness, he slipped from his bed, picked up his bag, and began to make his way through the darkened house. Every step was an agony of tension. Every small sound seemed deafening in the silence. A floorboard creaked beneath his weight, and he froze, heart hammering, waiting to see if anyone stirred. But the house remained quiet. He continued, navigating by the faint moonlight that filtered through high windows, his hands trailing along walls for guidance in the darkness. He reached the door he had chosen for his exit, a small portal that led into a side alley, rarely used at night. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the simple latch, wincing at the small click it made when it opened. But again, no alarm was raised. He slipped through the door and closed it carefully behind him. And just like that, he was outside, free, taking the first step on a journey that would either lead to a new life or to ruin. On the other side of that shared wall, Thisbe was making her own escape. She moved through her house like a ghost, soundless and invisible, her heart in her throat every step of the way. She had wrapped her cloak around her to conceal the bag she carried, and she walked with exaggerated care, placing each foot deliberately to avoid any noise. She reached her chosen exit, a door that opened onto the back courtyard. From there, she could access the alley that ran behind the row of houses. She eased the door open, grateful that her family kept the hinges well oiled, and stepped out into the cool night air. For a moment, she stood in the courtyard, looking up at the stars that had always fascinated her, seeing them now with new eyes. Those same stars would watch over her new life. They would be constant companions on whatever journey lay ahead. Then she moved to the back wall of the courtyard, where there was a small gate used by servants to access the alley. She unlatched it carefully and stepped through into the shadows beyond. Behind her, the gate clicked shut, and she walked away from her childhood home without looking back. Both lovers now moved through the sleeping city, taking different routes, but heading toward the same destination. The streets of Babylon at night were not entirely empty, but they were empty enough that two young people moving quietly could pass largely unnoticed. Pyramus kept to the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares where guards might patrol. Thisbe did the same, her hooded cloak concealing her face and identity. It took perhaps half an hour for each of them to reach the eastern gate. This was the most dangerous part of their journey through the city. The gates were supposed to be guarded at all hours, and technically, no one was supposed to enter or leave after sunset without special permission. But Pyramus had done his research. This particular gate was known to be understaffed and poorly supervised. The guards assigned to it were notorious for their laziness and corruption, and a small bribe was often enough to secure passage even at forbidden hours. As Pyramus approached the gate, he could see the guards huddled around a small fire, passing a wineskin between them. They barely glanced up as he approached, and when he quietly placed a few coins in the outstretched hand of the nearest guard, they simply waved him through without question. The massive wooden doors stood partially open, just wide enough for a single person to slip through. And Pyramus did exactly that, emerging on the other side into the open desert beyond Babylon's protective embrace. The sudden vastness was overwhelming. Inside the city, space was defined by walls and buildings, streets and courtyards. Everything had boundaries, limits, definition. But out here, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, lit by a moon that hung huge and bright in the clear night sky. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, carrying scents of sand and distant vegetation rather than the concentrated odors of human habitation. Pyramus stood for a moment, adjusting to this new environment, letting his eyes fully adapt to the moonlight. Then he oriented himself, identifying the direction he needed to go. The tomb of Ninus was visible even from here, a dark mass rising against the star-filled sky. He began walking toward it, his footsteps crunching softly in the sand and gravel. About 15 minutes after Pyramus had passed through the gate, Thisbe arrived. She had moved more slowly through the city, taking extra care to remain unseen. And perhaps her natural caution had made her more careful than necessary. The same guards were still at their posts, though the wineskin had made several more rounds, and their alertness had decreased accordingly. When Thisbe approached, they barely looked at her, simply accepting her coins and gesturing for her to pass. She stepped through the gate and into the open desert, and immediately felt a rush of emotions so complex she could barely process them all. Fear, certainly. She had never been outside the city alone at night, and the vastness of the landscape was intimidating. But also exhilaration, a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. She was truly on her own now, no longer bound by her family's rules or society's expectations. In the space of a few steps, she had transformed from dutiful daughter to independent woman, from prisoner to free soul. She could see the tomb in the distance, and beyond it, though harder to make out, the dark shape of what must be the mulberry tree, her destination, the place where Pyramus would be waiting for her. She adjusted her cloak around her shoulders and began to walk, following the same path that Pyramus had taken minutes before. The distance was greater than either of them had anticipated. What had seemed like a short walk from the city walls proved to be closer to an hour's journey across uneven terrain. The desert was not the smooth, sandy expanse that artists sometimes depicted. It was rocky in places, with scattered boulders and loose gravel that made walking treacherous in the uncertain moonlight. There were patches of scrubby vegetation, tough plants that had adapted to survive in this harsh environment, their thorns catching at clothing and skin. Thisbe walked steadily, her eyes fixed on her destination, barely noticing the minor discomforts of the journey. All she could think about was reaching that tree, finding Pyramus waiting for her, and beginning their new life together. She rehearsed in her mind what she would say to him, how they would embrace, how they would laugh with relief that they had both made it safely. She reached the tomb of Ninus first. The structure loomed above her, a massive monument to a king who had lived and died centuries before. Even in its age and partial decay, it was impressive, built from enormous stone blocks that must have required hundreds of workers to move and position. Moonlight cast strange shadows across its surface, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move as clouds drifted across the moon's face. Just beyond the tomb, exactly as Pyramus had described, stood the mulberry tree. It was ancient and enormous, its trunk thick and gnarled with age, its branches spreading wide to create a natural canopy. Even in the dim light, Thisbe could see the pale shapes of its fruit, the white berries that gave the tree its distinctive appearance. The berries hung in heavy clusters, not yet fully ripe, their color almost luminous against the dark leaves. Beneath the tree was the spring Pyramus had mentioned, a small pool of water fed by some underground source. The water glittered in the moonlight, and the sound of it trickling over stones was the only noise in the otherwise silent night. It was a peaceful spot, almost magically so, the kind of place that might have been sacred to ancient peoples who saw divinity in natural beauty. Thisbe approached the tree with a sense of wonder. This was it. This was the place where her old life would end, and her new one would begin. She looked around, expecting to see Pyramus waiting for her, but the area appeared empty. She must have arrived first. That was fine. She would wait for him beneath the tree's protective branches, resting after her long walk, preparing herself for the next stage of their journey. She settled herself at the base of the tree, arranging her cloak around her against the desert's nighttime chill. From this position, she could see the path she had taken from the city. When Pyramus appeared, she would spot him immediately. She leaned back against the tree's solid trunk, feeling its rough bark through the fabric of her clothing, and allowed herself to relax for the first time since beginning her escape. The minutes passed slowly. Thisbe's initial excitement gradually gave way to a calmer state, though her anticipation remained strong. She watched the path, eager for the first glimpse of Pyramus's approaching figure. She imagined how he would look, walking toward her through the moonlight, how his face would light up when he saw her waiting for him. She thought about what they would say to each other, how they would plan the next steps of their journey. But as more time passed, with no sign of him, a small seed of worry began to grow in her mind. What if something had gone wrong? What if he had been discovered leaving his house or stopped by guards at the gate? What if he had taken a different path and gotten lost in the darkness? She pushed these thoughts away, reminding herself that Pyramus was capable and clever. He would come. She just needed to be patient. And then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the tomb, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The lioness. The sound was low and deep, somewhere between a growl and a cough. Unmistakably animal and unmistakably large. Thisbe froze, every muscle in her body tensing, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She stared into the darkness, trying to see what had made that noise, but the shadows beyond the tomb were impenetrable. The sound came again, closer this time, and now there could be no doubt about what it was. A lion, or more likely, given the slightly higher pitch, a lioness. They were not uncommon in this region, despite the proximity to the city. They hunted in the desert and the scrublands beyond, preying on gazelles, wild sheep, and occasionally livestock that strayed too far from human protection. Attacks on humans were rare, but not unheard of, especially at night when the big cats were most active. Thisbe's mind raced, trying to remember everything she had ever heard about lions. Should she stay still and hope it passed by? Should she try to make noise to scare it away? Should she run? Every option seemed fraught with danger. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them against the tree trunk behind her, using its solidity to anchor herself against the wave of terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The lioness emerged from the darkness into the moonlit area near the spring, and the sight of it drove all rational thought from Thisbe's mind. The animal was enormous, larger than she had imagined possible. Its body was lean and muscular, built for power and speed. Its coat was tawny and sleek, catching the moonlight as it moved. But what captured Thisbe's horrified attention was the creature's muzzle and chest. They were stained dark with blood, still wet and fresh. The lioness had recently killed and fed, and the evidence of its meal was written across its body in crimson. The great cat moved toward the spring with the confident stride of an apex predator that feared nothing. It lowered its massive head to the water and began to drink, lapping at the cool liquid with a tongue that was visible even from where Thisbe crouched frozen against the tree. The lioness seemed unaware of Thisbe's presence, focused entirely on quenching its thirst after its meal. But Thisbe knew that could change in an instant. Lions had keen senses. At any moment, the creature might catch her scent on the night breeze, or hear the frightened hammering of her heart, or simply look up and see her there. And though it had recently fed, there was no guarantee it wouldn't attack. Animals could be unpredictable, especially predators who saw humans as potential threats or competitors. She had to move. She had to get away from this place, to put distance between herself and the lioness before it noticed her. But she had to do it quietly, carefully, without drawing attention to herself. The slightest wrong move, the smallest sound, could trigger the predator's hunting instincts. With agonizing slowness, Thisbe began to ease herself away from the tree. She kept her movements smooth and controlled, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. One step, then another, her eyes never leaving the lioness as it continued to drink. The sound of the water trickling over stones helped mask the soft crunch of her footsteps on the sandy ground. She had moved perhaps 10 feet from the tree when disaster struck. Her veil, the delicate fabric she wore to cover her face, as unmarried women often did, caught on something. A broken branch, a protruding root, some obstacle she hadn't noticed in her focused attention on the lioness. She felt the tug and instinctively pulled forward to free it. But the fabric was caught fast. She pulled harder, panic beginning to override caution. And suddenly, the veil tore free. But the motion was too sudden, too violent. The lioness's head snapped up, water dripping from its muzzle, its golden eyes fixing on Thisbe with predatory intensity. For a frozen moment, human and animal stared at each other across the small distance that separated them. Thisbe could see the intelligence in those eyes, the calculation, the instinctive assessment of threat and prey. Then the lioness's muscles bunched, and Thisbe knew it was going to charge. In that instant, all her careful control shattered. She turned and ran, abandoning any attempt at stealth, driven by pure survival instinct. Behind her, she heard the lioness roar, a sound so loud and terrifying that it seemed to shake the very air. And then the thunder of massive paws hitting the ground as the creature gave chase. Thisbe ran as she had never run before, her heart feeling like it would burst from her chest, her breath coming in gasping sobs. The tomb of Ninus was ahead of her, its massive structure offering potential shelter if she could reach it. She ran toward it, her legs pumping, her arms swinging, every ounce of her being focused on reaching safety. But in her panicked flight, she didn't notice that her veil had slipped from her grasp entirely. The delicate fabric, torn from whatever had snagged it, fluttered to the ground behind her like a wounded bird. She didn't realize she had lost it, too consumed by terror to notice anything except the need to escape. She kept running, and the tomb was getting closer, its entrance visible now, a dark opening that might offer sanctuary. Behind her, the lioness had stopped its charge. The creature had not been seriously pursuing prey. It was already sated from its earlier meal. The chase had been more warning than hunting, a way of driving off a potential threat to its water source. When Thisbe's veil settled on the ground, the lioness approached it curiously, sniffing at the strange object that smelled of human, but was not human itself. The great cat pawed at the veil, turning it over, investigating this new thing in its territory. And in doing so, still having traces of blood on its muzzle and paws from its recent kill, it stained the fabric. The delicate veil, the garment that Thisbe had worn to cover her face, became marked with dark smears of blood, torn in places by the lioness's claws, trampled into the dusty ground. After a few minutes of investigation, the lioness lost interest in the veil. It returned to the spring for another drink, then moved off into the darkness, heading away from the area, back toward whatever den or hunting ground it called home. The night grew quiet again, peaceful, as if nothing had disturbed it. Thisbe, meanwhile, had reached the tomb and found a place to hide within its ancient structure. There were openings in the monument's walls where stones had fallen or been removed over the centuries, and she squeezed herself into one of these gaps, making herself as small as possible, barely breathing, listening for any sound that might indicate the lioness was still hunting for her. She stayed there for a long time, too terrified to move, her body shaking with reaction to her narrow escape. Gradually, as the minutes passed, with no further sounds of danger, her heartbeat began to slow. Her breathing became less ragged. The immediate terror faded, replaced by a different kind of fear. Pyramus. He would be coming soon, if he wasn't already on his way. He would arrive at the meeting place, expecting to find her waiting beneath the mulberry tree. But she wasn't there. She was here, hiding in the ruins of an ancient tomb, too frightened to return to their planned meeting spot. What if he thought she hadn't come? What if he thought she had abandoned him, broken her promise? But surely he would wait for her. They had promised to wait for each other, no matter what. And once enough time had passed, once she was certain the lioness had truly gone, she would return to the tree. She would explain what had happened, and they would laugh about it, and it would become a story they told in years to come about their dramatic escape from Babylon. She didn't think about the veil. In her terror and confusion, She had forgotten entirely about losing it. She didn't know that it lay on the ground near the spring, bloodied and torn. A silent witness that would tell a story, but tell it wrong, twisting the truth into tragedy. Pyramus arrives. Pyramus had been delayed, not by anything dramatic or dangerous, simply by caution. He had taken a different route through the city than he had originally planned, avoiding an area where he had unexpectedly seen one of his father's business associates. The detour had added extra time to his journey. And then, at the eastern gate, the guards had been more alert than he had anticipated, requiring more negotiation and a larger bribe than he had prepared for. By the time he finally emerged from Babylon and began his walk across the desert toward the tomb of Ninus, he was anxious and frustrated. Thisbe would already be there, waiting for him, probably worried about what had delayed him. He walked as quickly as the terrain allowed, occasionally breaking into a jog when the ground was smooth enough, driven by his desire to reach her and ease whatever concerns she must be feeling. The tomb finally came into view, and beyond it, he could see the distinctive shape of the mulberry tree. His heart lifted. He was almost there. In just a few more minutes, he would see Thisbe, would hold her in his arms for the first time, would begin the new life they had planned together. All the fear and tension of the escape, all the uncertainty about their future suddenly seemed insignificant. They had done it. They had escaped Babylon, and they were free. As he approached the tree, he called out softly, "Thisbe, are you there?" He expected to see her emerge from beneath the tree's branches, expected to hear her voice responding to his call. But there was only silence, broken only by the gentle sound of water from the spring. A feeling of unease began to creep into Pyramus's mind. Had she not arrived yet? That seemed unlikely. She should have reached the meeting place before him, given his delays. Had something happened to prevent her from leaving? Or worse, had she decided not to come, changed her mind about their plan? He walked closer to the tree, and that's when he saw it. The veil, lying on the ground near the spring, pale in the moonlight, unmistakably feminine, unmistakably Thisbe's. But something was wrong with it. Even from a distance, he could see that it was torn and disheveled, not neatly folded or carefully placed, but sprawled across the ground as if it had been dropped or thrown there. Pyramus's walk became a run. He rushed to the veil and dropped to his knees beside it, his hands reaching out to pick it up. And as soon as he touched it, as soon as his fingers made contact with the fabric, he felt the dampness, and in the moonlight he could see the dark stains that covered it, Blood. The veil was covered in blood. "No," Pyramus whispered, the word barely audible. "No, no, no." He lifted the veil, holding it up to examine it more closely, hoping desperately that he was wrong, that the stains were something else, anything else. But there was no mistaking it. The fabric was torn in several places, the tears looking like they had been made by claws. The blood was still somewhat fresh, not yet fully dried. Pyramus's mind raced, trying to understand what he was seeing, trying to construct a narrative that made sense of these terrible facts. Thisbe had been here. She had dropped or lost her veil. And something had attacked her, something with claws and teeth, something that had drawn blood. He looked around frantically, his eyes searching the area illuminated by moonlight. "Thisbe," he called, louder now, not caring who might hear. "Thisbe, where are you?" Only silence answered him. He stood up, still holding the bloodied cloak, and began to search the area more systematically. He looked beneath the mulberry tree, around the spring, near the tomb. He searched desperately for any other sign of her, any clue about what had happened. And then he found the tracks. In the soft sand near the spring, clearly visible in the bright moonlight, were the unmistakable paw prints of a large cat, a lion or lioness, judging by the size and shape. The tracks led to the spring, where the ground was disturbed as if the animal had stopped to drink, and then away again, heading off into the darkness. The story wrote itself in Pyramus's horrified imagination. Thisbe had arrived first and waited for him beneath the tree. While she waited, a lioness had come to the spring to drink. The animal had attacked her, and Thisbe had tried to run, her veil falling or being torn from her in the struggle. The blood on the fabric was her blood, and the lioness had carried her off into the darkness, where Pyramus couldn't complete the thought. He couldn't allow himself to imagine what had happened to Thisbe in the lioness's jaws. But the evidence was overwhelming. The bloody veil, the tracks, her absence, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Thisbe was dead. The woman he loved, the woman he had planned to spend his life with, had been killed by a predator while waiting for him at their meeting place. And it was his fault. If he had been on time, if he had arrived when he was supposed to, he would have been here with her. He could have protected her, scared away the lioness, prevented the tragedy. But he had been late, delayed by his excessive caution and his bad luck at the gate. And because of those delays, Thisbe had been alone when the animal came. She had died alone, frightened, probably calling out for him, wondering why he hadn't come to save her. The guilt was crushing, a physical weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He fell to his knees again, still clutching the bloody veil, and a sound came from his throat that was part sob, part howl of anguish. The pain was unbearable, worse than any physical injury could be. It felt like his heart was being torn from his chest, like his very soul was being ripped apart. "I'm sorry," he gasped out between sobs. "Thisbe, I'm so sorry. I should have been here. I should have protected you. This is my fault. All my fault." He knelt there for long minutes, weeping into the blood-stained fabric, his body shaking with the force of his grief. Everything they had planned, everything they had hoped for, was gone. Their future together, the life they would have built, the children they might have had, the old age they might have shared, all of it erased in a moment of violent death. And for what? So they could escape families who didn't approve of their love? So they could flee a city that had given them everything except the one thing they truly wanted? The irony was bitter and terrible. They had tried to take control of their own destinies, and instead had walked straight into tragedy. Pyramus's grief gradually transformed into something else. Anger. At himself, certainly, for being late, but also at fate, at the cruel universe that would bring two people together only to tear them apart in the most brutal way possible, at the families whose pointless feud had driven them to this desperate act, at the very gods themselves, if they existed, for allowing such injustice to occur. But mostly, he felt a desperate, hollow emptiness. What was the point of living now? Thisbe had been his entire future. Without her, he had nothing to live for. He couldn't return to Babylon. His family would never forgive his attempted flight. And besides, he couldn't face them, knowing that his actions had led to Thisbe's death. He couldn't continue on to the eastern cities alone. Every step of that journey would have been meaningless without her to share it. There was only one path left to him now, only one way to make amends for his failure, to join Thisbe wherever death had taken her, to refuse to live in a world that no longer contained the light of her presence. His hand moved to his belt, where he carried the knife he had brought for protection. He drew it slowly, its blade glinting in the moonlight. The knife was sharp. He had made sure of that before leaving Babylon. It would do what needed to be done quickly, efficiently, with minimal suffering. He looked up at the mulberry tree towering above him, its branches spreading wide against the star-filled sky, its white berries hanging in heavy clusters It seemed fitting somehow that this should be the last thing he saw. This tree that was supposed to have witnessed the beginning of their new life together would instead witness his death. Perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps that was the way the story was always meant to end. "Forgive me, Thisbe," he whispered. "Forgive me for failing you. I'm coming to find you now. Wherever you are, whatever lies beyond death, I will find you there. We will be together again, even if we cannot be together in life." He placed the point of the knife against his chest, positioning it carefully over his heart. His hand was steady now, his purpose clear. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. This was what needed to happen. This was the only ending that made sense. With one swift motion, he drove the blade into his chest. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. A white-hot fire that spread through his body like lightning. But somehow, beneath the physical agony, there was also relief. He had made his choice. He had refused to live in a world without Thisbe. Whatever came next, wherever death took him, at least he would not have to endure the unbearable burden of her loss. He fell backward, his body hitting the ground at the base of the mulberry tree. Above him, the branches swayed gently in the night breeze, and he could see the white berries hanging in clusters against the star-filled sky. Beautiful, he thought distantly. Everything is so beautiful. Why had he never noticed before? The blood was flowing freely from the wound now, soaking into his clothes, pooling beneath him. And not just pooling, it was flowing toward the tree, seeping into the roots that spread through the soil like underground veins. The ancient tree, with its deep root system, developed over centuries of growth, drew the blood upward through capillary action, pulling it into its vascular system just as it pulled water from the spring nearby. The white berries began to change, starting with those closest to where Pyramus lay. The color shifted from pale cream to pink, from pink to red, from red to a deep crimson that was almost purple. The transformation spread through the tree like a blush spreading across skin, moving from branch to branch, berry to berry, until the entire canopy was transformed. What had been white and innocent now blazed with the color of blood and sacrifice. Pyramus's vision was beginning to dim, darkness creeping in from the edges. His breathing had become shallow and labored. He could feel his heartbeat growing weaker, each pulse pushing more blood from the wound, draining away his life with every passing second. But even as consciousness faded, his final thoughts were of Thisbe, her voice, her laughter, the way her eye had looked at him through that crack in the wall, full of love and hope. "I'm sorry," he whispered one last time to the empty night. "I'm so sorry, my love." And then there was only darkness and silence and the sound of water trickling over stones. Thisbe's return. Time passed. How much time? It's impossible to say with certainty. Perhaps a quarter of an hour, perhaps less. But in that brief span, tragedy had already struck its devastating blow, and now it was preparing to deliver its final, crushing act. Thisbe had remained hidden in the tomb, her heart gradually settling from its panicked gallop, her breathing returning to something close to normal. The terror of her encounter with the lioness had been profound. But now that she was safe, now that enough time had passed without any sign of the predator returning, her thoughts were turning back to Pyramus. He must have arrived by now. He must be waiting for her at the tree, confused and worried about where she had gone. The thought of him there, alone, thinking she had abandoned him, was unbearable. She had to return. She had to let him know that she was safe, that she hadn't broken her promise. She emerged from her hiding place, cautiously, listening carefully for any sound that might indicate danger. But the night was peaceful again. The desert had returned to its normal nocturnal rhythm, disturbed only by the occasional call of a night bird or the rustle of some small creature moving through the scrub. She began walking back toward the mulberry tree, and as she approached, something struck her as strange. Even from a distance, even in the uncertain moonlight, the tree looked different. It took her a moment to understand what had changed, and when she did, confusion washed over her. The berries were no longer white. They were dark now, a deep, reddish purple that was almost black in the dim light. How was that possible? She had been gone for such a short time. Trees didn't change like that, didn't transform from one color to another in the space of minutes. What had happened? She walked closer, drawn by the mystery, and as she neared the tree, she began to make out a shape on the ground beneath its branches, a dark mass that hadn't been there before. Her steps slowed, confusion giving way to a creeping sense of dread that she couldn't quite name. And then she was close enough to see clearly, and the world stopped making sense. Pyramus lay beneath the tree, motionless, his clothes soaked with blood, his face pale as marble in the moonlight. His knife was still buried in his chest. His hands had fallen away from it, and his eyes were closed. Around him, the ground was dark with his blood, and that blood had stained the roots of the tree, had been drawn up into its trunk and branches, had transformed the white berries into monuments of crimson. For a long moment, Thisbe simply stood there, unable to process what she was seeing. Her mind rejected it, insisted that this couldn't be real, that she must be mistaken, that this was some other person, some stranger, not her Pyramus. But there was no mistaking that face, those features she had memorized from glimpses through the crack in the wall, from descriptions they had shared with each other during their whispered conversations. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "No, no, 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 no." She rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him, afraid that touching him would make it real. But she had to know. She had to be certain. Her hand reached out, trembling, and touched his face. His skin was still warm, but there was no life in it. No breath, no heartbeat, no sign of the vibrant young man who had promised to meet her here, to begin a new life with her. He was gone. Pyramus was dead. A sound came from Thisbe's throat that was barely human, a wail of such pure anguish that it seemed to echo across the desert, reaching toward the indifferent stars. She gathered his body into her arms, cradling his head against her chest, her tears falling onto his still face. "Why?" she sobbed. "Why did you do this? I'm here. I'm alive. I'm here, Pyramus. Wake up. Please wake up." But the dead do not wake, and Pyramus had gone beyond any place where her voice could reach him. She held him and wept, rocking back and forth, unable to accept the terrible reality of what had happened. And then, through her grief, understanding began to dawn. She saw her cloak lying nearby, torn and blood-stained. She saw the tracks of the lioness in the soft earth. She understood. Pyramus had arrived and found the cloak. He had seen the blood and the tracks. He had assumed the worst. He had believed her dead, and in his grief, he had taken his own life rather than continue without her. The cruel irony of it was almost too much to bear. If she had been just a few minutes faster in returning, if she had left a sign, some indication that she was safe and hiding, if the lioness had never come to the spring, if, 1,000 small moments that could have changed everything, that could have prevented this tragedy, but instead had aligned with horrible precision to create it. "It's my fault," she whispered into his hair. "If I hadn't run, if I had stayed, You died thinking I was gone. You died believing I had left you alone. Oh, my love, my poor love, I'm so sorry." She held him for a long time, memorizing the feel of him, the weight of his body in her arms, storing up these final moments, because she knew with crystal clarity what she had to do next. There was no question about it, no decision to be made. The path forward was as clear as it was terrible. She couldn't live without him. The thought of returning to Babylon, of going back to that life of walls and whispers and forbidden love, was impossible. The thought of continuing on alone to those eastern cities they had dreamed of visiting together was equally unthinkable. Every future she could imagine was hollow and meaningless without Pyramus to share it. More than that, she couldn't bear the idea of him being alone in death. He had gone into that darkness, believing she was already there, believing he would find her waiting for him. She couldn't let him search for her in whatever afterlife existed. She had to follow. She had to keep her promise, even if that promise now meant following him into death rather than into life. With trembling hands, she reached for the knife still buried in his chest. The handle was slick with his blood, and she had to grip it tightly to pull it free. The blade came out with a sickening sound, and fresh blood welled from the wound. She held the weapon, feeling its weight, its reality, its terrible purpose. Before she used it, she looked up at the mulberry tree towering above her, its berries now the color of the blood that had stained them. In that moment, the tree seemed to her like a witness to their tragedy, the only living thing that understood what had happened here. And she wanted it to remember. She needed some memorial to exist, some lasting proof that their love had been real, even if it had ended in death. "Hear me, you gods," she called out, her voice raw with grief, but strong with purpose. "You who see everything, who watch the affairs of mortals from your distant thrones, I ask this of you. Let this tree remember us. Let these berries remain this color, dark as blood, as a sign of what happened here tonight. Let them be a memorial to love that was true, but doomed. To two hearts that beat as one, but were torn apart by cruel fate." She paused, looking down at Pyramus one more time, committing his face to memory. "And I ask one more thing. When they find us, and they will find us, let our families honor this one request. Let them place our ashes together in a single urn. In death, let us have the unity that was denied to us in life. Let us be together always and forever. Then, before fear or second thoughts could stop her, before the survival instinct could override her will, she positioned the point of the blade against her own chest, exactly where Pyramus had placed it. She thought of him, of his voice, of all the promises they had made to each other. She thought of the life they would never have, the children they would never raise, the old age they would never share. And she thought of death, not as an ending, but as a doorway through which she would pass to find him waiting on the other side. "I'm coming, my love," she whispered. "Wait for me. I'm coming to find you." And with that, she drove the blade home. The pain was immediate and terrible, but she did not cry out. Instead, she pulled the knife free and let it fall from her hand. Then she lowered herself carefully beside Pyramus, arranging her body so that she lay next to him, their hands finding each other in death as they had never been able to in life. Her blood joined his, flowing into the ground, feeding the roots of the mulberry tree, adding to the transformation that had already begun. And as her vision dimmed and darkness closed in around her, her last sight was of the berries above, dark and beautiful against the stars, a lasting memorial to their love and their tragedy. The aftermath and the gods' answer. Dawn came to the desert as it always did, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, driving away the shadows of night with its relentless light. The tomb of Ninus emerged from darkness, its ancient stones catching the first rays of the sun. The mulberry tree stood as it had for decades, but now transformed, its berries no longer white, but a deep purple red that seemed to glow in the morning light. And beneath that tree lay two bodies, two young lovers whose story had ended in tragedy beneath its branches. They were discovered mid-morning by a merchant traveling the eastern road who had stopped at the spring to water his animals. The sight of the bodies sent him hurrying back to Babylon with news of the tragedy. Within hours, a crowd had gathered at the scene, drawn by morbid curiosity and genuine grief. Among that crowd were two families, the parents of Pyramus and Thisbe, who had spent a sleepless night searching for their missing children. They had discovered the escapes simultaneously when checking their children's rooms at first light. The empty beds, the missing belongings, the signs of clandestine departure, all had painted a clear picture. And when word came of two bodies found beneath the mulberry tree outside the city, they had known with horrible certainty whose bodies they would be. The mothers arrived first, and their cries of anguish echoed across the desert when they saw what had happened. These were the women who had given birth to these children, who had raised them, loved them, protected them throughout their lives. And now they knelt beside their gaulled bodies, weeping as only mothers can weep for dead children. The fathers came next, their faces hard with the grief that men often mask behind anger and stoicism. But when they saw their children, when they truly understood what had happened, that hardness crumbled. These proud men, who had maintained a senseless feud for years, who had forbidden their children from even speaking to each other, fell to their knees and wept. Around the bodies, the evidence of what had happened was clear enough. The torn and bloodied cloak, the tracks of the lioness, the knife that both had used to end their lives, the blood-stained roots of the tree, the transformed berries hanging overhead. The story wrote itself for those who had eyes to see it. A tragic misunderstanding that had led to double suicide. And in that moment, seeing the terrible price of their pride and stubbornness, both families were finally united in grief, in guilt, in the devastating understanding of what their feud had cost. They looked at each other across the bodies of their children, and without words, an understanding passed between them. This was their doing. Their hatred had driven these young people to this desperate act. Their refusal to allow love to bridge the gap between the families had resulted in deaths that could have been prevented. The mother of Pyramus reached across her son's body and took the hand of Thisbe's mother. The two women, who had been enemies their entire lives, who had never spoken except in anger, held each other's hands and wept together. The fathers embraced, their old grudges seeming suddenly petty and meaningless in the face of such loss. "We killed them," Pyramus's father said, his voice broken. "Our pride, our foolish hatred. We killed them as surely as if we had wielded the knife ourselves." "They loved each other," Thisbe's mother sobbed. "They only wanted to be together, and we drove them to this." The grief was profound and shared. Both families had lost their most precious treasures, and that loss was made even more bitter by the knowledge that it could have been prevented. If they had put aside their feud, if they had allowed the young people to court openly, to marry, to build a life together, they would still be alive. They would be planning a wedding instead of a funeral. There would be joy instead of this crushing sorrow. As the day wore on, arrangements were made for the bodies to be returned to the city. But before they were moved, Thisbe's father made a discovery that would prove significant. Clutched in his daughter's hand was a small piece of parchment, the ink smudged and barely legible. It was part of the note she had been writing to her parents before changing her mind and leaving it behind. The fragment that remained read, "Cannot live without each other. In death, let us be together." The meaning was clear. Thisbe had foreseen this possibility, had expressed a final wish. And when her father shared this with the other family, they all agreed immediately. Despite the traditions that called for separate family burials, despite the conventions that would normally keep even the ashes of the dead separated by family lines, they would honor this request. Pyramus and Thisbe would be together in death as they had been denied in life. The funeral pyre was built with care and ceremony. Both families contributed wood, and rather than constructing two separate pyres, as would have been customary, they built a single large one. The bodies were placed upon it side by side, dressed in their finest clothes, their hands arranged so that they touched even in death. As the flames rose and began their work, transforming mortal flesh to ash and bone, the gathered crowd stood in silence. There was something profound happening here, something that went beyond simple grief. These deaths had meaning. They spoke to the power of love, to the tragedy of pride, to the terrible consequences of allowing old grudges to poison the present and future. When the fire had burned itself out and the ashes had cooled, they were gathered carefully and placed together in a single urn of exceptional beauty. It was crafted from alabaster, white as the mulberry berries had once been, and carved with images of the lovers meeting beneath a tree. The urn was sealed and placed in a tomb that both families would share, a final symbol of the unity that should have existed all along. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of this tragedy was yet to come. The gods, watching from their distant realm, had heard Thisbe's prayer. They had witnessed the lovers' devotion, their willingness to die rather than live without each other. And they were moved. In the myths and legends of the ancient world, divine intervention often comes too late to prevent tragedy, but arrives in time to create remembrance. The gods could not restore life to Pyramus and Thisbe. Death, once embraced, was not easily reversed, even by divine power. But they could grant Thisbe's request for a memorial, for something that would ensure the lovers' story would never be forgotten. The mulberry tree, which had drunk the blood of both lovers, which had transformed from white to red in the course of that terrible night, would remain changed forever. From that day forward, across all the lands where mulberry trees grew, the berries would ripen to that same deep purple red. What had been white and innocent would forever bear the color of blood and sacrifice, a living reminder of what had happened beneath its branches. This transformation served multiple purposes in the ancient understanding. It was a memorial, certainly, ensuring that the story would be passed down through generations. Every time someone ate a mulberry or saw the tree's dark fruit, they would be reminded of Pyramus and Thisbe. But it was also a warning, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, the destructiveness of feuds, and the tragic consequences that can follow when love is forbidden. The tree itself became a pilgrimage site. Lovers from across Babylon and beyond would travel to visit it, to stand in the shade of its branches and make promises to each other. Some brought offerings, small tokens of devotion that they would leave at the tree's base. Others carved their initials into the bark, adding their own love stories to the one that had ended in tragedy. The spring beside the tree became known as the Lover's Spring, and it was said that those who drank from it while thinking of their beloved would enjoy lasting devotion. The families of Pyramus and Thisbe were forever changed by the tragedy. The ancient feud that had divided them died with the young lovers. In the years that followed, the two households became close, supporting each other through their shared grief, eventually merging their business interests and becoming one of the most successful merchant families in Babylon. But their success was always bittersweet, flavored by the knowledge of what it had cost. The mothers, in particular, became inseparable friends. They would often visit the tomb together, bringing flowers and incense, speaking to their dead children as if they could still hear. They told them about the changes in the city, about the family's new unity, about everything they were missing. And perhaps, in some way beyond mortal understanding, Pyramus and Thisbe did hear those voices and knew that their deaths, while tragic, had not been entirely in vain. The eternal echo, through literature and time. The story of Pyramus and Thisbe did not end with their deaths, or even with the transformation of the mulberry tree. Their tale became one of the most influential love stories in Western literature, echoing through the centuries and inspiring countless other works. The Roman poet Ovid, who lived from 43 BC to AD 17 or 18, included their story in his masterwork Metamorphoses, a collection of myths involving transformations. It was through Ovid's beautiful and tragic telling that the story gained its widest audience and most enduring form. Ovid's version was likely composed around the year 3 AD as part of his ambitious Metamorphoses project, though he continued working on it until his exile in 8 AD. Whether the story was based on actual events or was entirely mythological is impossible to say with certainty. What we do know is that Ovid crafted it with such skill, with such psychological insight into the hearts and minds of young lovers that it felt real to his readers. They could understand Pyramus and Thisbe's desperation, could sympathize with their desire to escape their family's control, could feel the crushing weight of the misunderstanding that led to their deaths. The elements that made Pyramus and Thisbe's story so compelling were universal: forbidden love, family opposition, secret communication, a desperate escape plan, tragic misunderstanding, and death. These are themes that resonate across cultures and time periods because they touch on fundamental human experiences and emotions. Love has always faced obstacles, whether from family disapproval, social convention, or simple bad luck. And the fear of losing one's beloved, the desperation that can drive people to extreme acts, these are feelings that anyone who has loved deeply can understand, even if they would never actually act on them as Pyramus and Thisbe did. As Christianity spread across Europe and the Roman Empire fell, many pagan myths and stories were lost or suppressed. But some, including the tale of Pyramus and Thisbe, survived. The story was morally instructive, teaching lessons about the dangers of pride and the importance of clear communication, lessons that aligned well enough with Christian values that the story could be preserved even in a new religious context. Medieval scholars copied Ovid's Metamorphoses by hand, preserving it through the Dark Ages, and with it, they preserved the story of the Babylonian lovers. During the medieval period, the story underwent various adaptations and retellings. In the 14th century, the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio included a version in his work On Famous Women, though he framed it more as a cautionary tale about the dangers of disobedience to parents than as a celebration of romantic love. Geoffrey Chaucer mentioned the story in his Legend of Good Women around 1386, presenting Thisbe as an exemplar of faithful love. John Gower included it in his Confessio Amantis around the same period, again emphasizing the moral lessons. But the most famous adaptation of the Pyramus and Thisbe story would come in the late 16th century from England's greatest playwright, William Shakespeare, in creating Romeo and Juliet, first performed around 1594 or 1595. Shakespeare drew heavily on the ancient myth. The parallels are impossible to miss. Two young lovers from feuding families, secret meetings, a desperate plan to escape and be together, tragic misunderstanding, and double suicide. The similarities are so strong that some scholars have suggested Romeo and Juliet is essentially a Renaissance retelling of Pyramus and Thisbe, transposed from ancient Babylon to medieval Verona, but preserving the essential emotional and narrative elements that made the original so powerful. Romeo dying by poison after believing Juliet is dead, and Juliet awakening to find him dead and then killing herself with his dagger. These are clear echoes of Pyramus stabbing himself after finding Thisbe's bloody cloak, and Thisbe then using the same weapon to end her own life. Even Shakespeare's lighter play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, includes a direct reference to Pyramus and Thisbe. In that comedy, a group of amateur actors performs a hilariously bad version of the tragic tale, treating it with absurd melodrama that both honors and parodies the original. Through this play within a play, Shakespeare acknowledged the ancient story's importance while also demonstrating his ability to find humor even in tragedy. The influence didn't stop with Shakespeare. The basic plot structure of Pyramus and Thisbe, forbidden love leading to tragic misunderstanding and death, has appeared in countless works across multiple cultures and time periods. The story has been adapted into operas, ballets, paintings, sculptures, and modern novels and films. Each generation finds new ways to tell essentially the same story because the emotions at its heart remain universal and eternally relevant. In the 19th century, the pre-Raphaelite painters were particularly drawn to the story, creating dramatic and emotionally charged works depicting various scenes from the tale. Edward Burne-Jones created a series of paintings showing the lovers' story, from their first meeting through the crack in the wall to their tragic deaths beneath the mulberry tree. These paintings captured the romantic tragedy of the tale in ways that resonated with Victorian sensibilities, while also introducing the story to new audiences who might never have read Ovid. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the story has continued to appear in new forms. Modern novels have retold it in contemporary settings, moving the lovers from ancient Babylon to modern cities, but preserving the essential elements of forbidden love and tragic miscommunication. Young adult literature has been particularly drawn to the story, perhaps because teenagers are the ones most likely to experience the intensity of first love and the frustration of parental opposition. The psychological aspects of the story have also drawn increased attention from modern readers and scholars. Why would Pyramus and Thisbe choose death so quickly, without making absolutely certain of what had happened? A modern reader might wonder why Pyramus didn't search more thoroughly for Thisbe's body before assuming she was dead. Why didn't Thisbe check more carefully to see if Pyramus was truly beyond saving before taking her own life? But these questions miss the essential nature of the story. Pyramus and Thisbe were not meant to be rational actors, carefully weighing their options and making measured decisions. They were young people, consumed by passion, driven by emotion rather than logic. When Pyramus saw what he believed to be evidence of Thisbe's death, he didn't stop to analyze the situation carefully because his grief was too overwhelming. And when Thisbe found Pyramus's body, she didn't consider trying to save him or going for help because the thought of living without him was unbearable. This is what makes their story so powerful and so timeless. They represent love in its purest and most extreme form, love that recognizes no boundaries, accepts no compromises, and would rather embrace death than accept separation. Whether we view their actions as romantic or tragic, noble or foolish, we cannot deny their emotional authenticity. They felt what they felt completely and absolutely, and they acted on those feelings without hesitation or calculation. The mulberry tree itself has taken on symbolic significance far beyond the original story. The transformation of its berries from white to dark red has been interpreted in numerous ways. On the most obvious level, it represents the physical staining by the lover's blood. But symbolically, it represents the transformation from innocence to experience, from purity to passion, from life to death. The white berries were innocent, untouched by tragedy. The red berries carry the weight of sacrifice and loss. In botanical terms, white mulberries do exist, though they are less common than the dark purple variety that is most familiar to modern audiences. The species Morus alba produces fruit that is typically white or pale pink when ripe, while Morus nigra produces the dark purple-black fruit most commonly seen. The myth provides a poetic explanation for why the darker varieties exist, suggesting they carry within them the memorial of an ancient tragedy. The symbolism of color in the story extends beyond just the berries. The bloodstains on Thisbe's cloak, Pyramus's assumptions about what those stains meant, the blood flowing into the tree's roots, all of these involve the transformation from one state to another through the medium of blood. Blood as life force, blood as sacrifice, blood as the physical manifestation of love's ultimate price. The ancient world understood blood in ways that modern sanitized society often doesn't. Blood was sacred, powerful, transformative. Spilling it meant something profound. The location of the story in Babylon was significant for ancient audiences. Babylon represented the exotic East, a place of mystery and ancient wonders. The city's legendary walls, its hanging gardens, its Tower of Babel, all of these made it a perfect setting for a story about love that was larger than life. Ovid, in choosing to set the story there, rather than in the original Cilician location from earlier versions, was making the tale more romantic and mysterious for his Roman readers. The historical reality of Babylon, of course, was quite different from the legendary city of poetry and myth. By Ovid's time, the great city had long since fallen into decay, conquered first by the Persians, then by Alexander the Great, and finally abandoned in favor of new capitals. But in mythology, Babylon lived on as a symbol of ancient grandeur and lost glory, making it the perfect backdrop for a story about love that transcended ordinary human limitations. The universal truths within the tragedy. What makes Pyramus and Thisbe's story continue to resonate across millennia is not just its dramatic plot or its influence on later literature, but the universal truths it contains about love, family, communication, and fate. These themes speak to fundamental aspects of the human experience that remain relevant regardless of when or where we live. The most obvious theme is that of forbidden love and the destructive consequences of family feuds. The parents of Pyramus and Thisbe maintained their rivalry without apparently considering how it might affect their children. They assumed they could control their children's hearts as easily as they controlled their actions, requiring them to hate the neighbors simply because that's what the family had always done. But love doesn't respect such boundaries. Hearts choose their own paths, and attempts to force them into predetermined channels often lead to disaster. This theme had particular resonance in the ancient world, where arranged marriages were the norm, and children were expected to submit to their parents' choices in all matters, including marriage partners. The story of Pyramus and Thisbe suggested that love was a force powerful enough to override even the most sacred social obligations. This was both thrilling and frightening to ancient audiences, representing both wish fulfillment and cautionary tale. Modern readers might have more sympathy for the lovers than ancient audiences would have had. In contemporary Western society, we generally believe that individuals should choose their own romantic partners based on mutual affection rather than family preference. The idea of forbidding children from marrying someone they love simply because of an old family grudge seems unreasonable to us. But it's worth remembering that in many cultures today, arranged marriages are still common, and parental approval of romantic choices is still considered essential. For people in those contexts, Pyramus and Thisbe's story remains immediately relevant and powerful. The theme of miscommunication and tragic misunderstanding is equally universal. How many disasters in human history, personal and political, have resulted from failures of communication, from assumptions made without verification, from conclusions jumped to without sufficient evidence? Pyramus saw the bloody cloak and immediately assumed the worst. If he had searched more thoroughly, if he had called out for Thisbe, if he had waited even a little while, the tragedy might have been averted. But grief and panic overwhelmed reason, and he acted on incomplete information with irreversible consequences. This aspect of the story serves as a warning about the dangers of hasty action based on emotional responses rather than careful thought. In our own lives, we've all probably experienced moments where we reacted to something based on initial appearances, only to discover later that the reality was quite different from what we assumed. Usually, the consequences of such mistakes are relatively minor. Embarrassment, perhaps, or a damaged relationship that can be repaired. But Pyramus and Thisbe's story reminds us that sometimes the consequences of miscommunication can be catastrophic and permanent. The role of fate in the story is complex and has been interpreted in various ways by different audiences. From one perspective, the tragedy seems almost absurdly dependent on coincidence and bad timing. If Thisbe had arrived just a few minutes later, she would have missed the lioness entirely. If Pyramus had arrived just a few minutes earlier, he would have been there when the lioness appeared and could have protected Thisbe. If the lioness had gone to a different water source, or if it hadn't just made a kill and thus had no blood on its muzzle, any number of small changes to the sequence of events could have prevented the tragedy. But from another perspective, the tragedy seems inevitable. Once Pyramus and Thisbe decided to defy their families and run away together, they set in motion a chain of events that was always going to end badly. Their love was doomed from the start because it existed in opposition to the social structures that governed their world. The specific mechanism of the tragedy, the lioness, the bloody cloak, the misunderstanding, might have been chance, but the fact that tragedy would result from their defiance was perhaps predetermined. The gods' response to the tragedy is also significant. They cannot or will not prevent the deaths, but they grant Thisbe's prayer for a memorial. This suggests a worldview in which divine powers are moved by human suffering and devotion, but are limited in their ability or willingness to intervene in mortal affairs. The gods can commemorate and remember, can ensure that sacrifice is not forgotten, but they cannot, or choose not to, prevent the sacrifice in the first place. This divine ambivalence reflects ancient understanding of the relationship between gods and humans. The gods were not all-powerful or all-benevolent in the ancient worldview. They had their own concerns, their own conflicts, their own limitations. They might take interest in human affairs, might even be moved by human suffering, but they did not exist primarily to ensure human happiness. The transformation of the mulberry tree is an act of divine acknowledgement, a way of saying we saw what happened and we recognize its significance, but it is not an act of salvation or prevention. The transformation itself carries multiple layers of meaning. On the literal level, it explains a natural phenomenon, why mulberry fruits are dark rather than white. This was a common function of myths in the ancient world, providing poetic explanations for observable facts about nature. But on a symbolic level, the transformation represents the way that tragedy and sacrifice can fundamentally alter the world, leaving permanent marks that future generations will see and remember. Every dark mulberry berry becomes a reminder that love is powerful enough to change reality itself, that the blood of lovers spilled in devotion can stain the very fabric of nature. The tree serves as both warning and inspiration. Warning against the dangers of forbidden love and hasty action. Inspiration through the example of devotion so complete that it would rather embrace death than accept separation. The psychological realism of the story has helped ensure its longevity. Despite being an ancient myth featuring gods and transformations, the emotional experiences of Pyramus and Thisbe feel authentic and recognizable. Their desperate desire to be together despite all obstacles, their willingness to give up everything else for their love, their overwhelming grief at the apparent loss of their beloved. These are emotions that any person who has loved deeply can understand and relate to. We might not approve of their final actions. We might wish they had been more cautious, more communicative, more willing to consider options other than immediate suicide. But we can understand the emotional logic that drove them to those actions. In the extremity of their love and grief, death seemed like the only acceptable option. Whether we view that as tragic folly or romantic devotion probably says more about us and our own experiences than it does about the story itself. The story also explores the relationship between individual desire and social obligation, a tension that has existed in every human society. Pyramus and Thisbe wanted to choose their own path, to create their own future based on mutual love rather than family politics. But their society demanded obedience to parental authority and respect for family feuds, no matter how pointless those feuds might be. When individual desire comes into irreconcilable conflict with social expectation, something has to give. In Pyramus and Thisbe's case, what gave was their lives. This remains relevant because every society has its own set of expectations and obligations that can conflict with individual desires. Modern Western society prides itself on individual freedom, but we still face pressure to conform to various social norms, to meet family expectations, to fit ourselves into predetermined categories and roles. The specifics may differ from ancient Babylon, but the fundamental tension remains. How much should we sacrifice of our own happiness to meet others' expectations? At what point does obligation become oppression? These are questions that Pyramus and Thisbe's story asks, but doesn't definitively answer, leaving each reader or listener to wrestle with them personally. The enduring power of star-crossed love. As our story comes to its close, we return to where we began, to the question of why this particular tale has endured for more than 2,000 years, inspiring countless adaptations and imitations. The answer lies in its perfect encapsulation of love's most essential and universal characteristics, its intensity, its irrationality, its power to override all other considerations, and its potential for both transcendence and tragedy. Pyramus and Thisbe loved with a completeness that most of us can only imagine or wish for. Their love was not diminished by obstacles, but intensified by them. The wall that separated them became the paradoxical source of their connection. Its crack, allowing them to whisper to each other while the rest of the world tried to keep them apart. Their willingness to give up everything, family, home, security, and ultimately life itself, for the sake of their love, represents an ideal that feels both admirable and terrifying. We recognize in their story the truth that love at its most intense is indeed a kind of madness, a state in which normal rules and rational calculations cease to apply. When Pyramus saw that bloody cloak, rational thought would have suggested multiple possible explanations, might have prompted a thorough search for evidence, would have counseled caution before making any irreversible decisions. But love, in its extremity, does not allow for such careful consideration. It demands immediate, absolute response. Similarly, when Thisbe found Pyramus dying or dead, a more measured response might have been to seek help, to try to save him if possible, to mourn him but continue living in his memory. But that kind of measured response would have felt like a betrayal of their love, which had always been about being together, about refusing to accept separation. For Thisbe, continuing to live without Pyramus would have meant admitting that life could be acceptable without him, and that admission would have negated everything their love represented. The story asks us to consider: what would you sacrifice for love? Where do you draw the line between devotion and self-destruction? These are not abstract questions. They speak to real choices that people face about how much of themselves their plans, their other relationships to give up for romantic love. Most of us will never face the stark choice between love and death that Pyramus and Thisbe faced. But we face smaller versions of that choice regularly. Love or career, love or family approval, love or personal ambition, love or security. The mulberry tree standing above their bodies becomes a symbol not just of their specific tragedy, but of all tragic love stories, all instances where devotion led to sacrifice, all moments when love proved both impossibly beautiful and impossible to sustain. The dark berries remind us that love always carries the potential for pain, that the intensity of the joy it brings is matched by the intensity of the suffering it can cause when things go wrong. And yet, despite knowing all this, despite understanding the dangers and the potential for tragedy, people continue to fall in love, continue to take risks for love, continue to believe that their love will be different, that their story will end in happiness rather than heartbreak. This stubborn optimism in the face of countless cautionary tales, like Pyramus and Thisbe's, is perhaps love's most remarkable characteristic. We cannot seem to help ourselves. The human heart insists on hoping, on believing, on reaching out toward connection, even when history suggests we should be more careful. The families of Pyramus and Thisbe learned too late that pride and old grudges are ultimately meaningless when measured against the value of the people we love. Their feud, whatever its original cause, seemed important enough to maintain for years, important enough to forbid their children from even speaking to each other. But in the face of their children's deaths, its importance evaporated. They would have given anything to take back that feud, to allow Pyramus and Thisbe to love each other openly, to live and be happy together. This, too, is a universal truth. We often realize what truly matters only when it's too late to act on that realization. How many of us maintain relationships with people we don't particularly like out of family obligation, while neglecting relationships with people we genuinely love? How many of us let pride or old hurts prevent us from reconciliation with those we've wronged or who've wronged us? How many of us would look back at the end of our lives and wish we had loved more openly, forgiven more readily, put aside our grudges and our pride in favor of human connection? Pyramus and Thisbe's story survived not because it has a happy ending, but because it has a true one. It acknowledges that love does not conquer all, that good intentions and pure hearts are not always enough to overcome circumstance and bad luck, that tragedy can strike the innocent as easily as the guilty. This honesty, this refusal to provide false comfort, is part of what makes the story so powerful and so lasting. But there is also hope in the story, strange as that might seem, given its tragic ending. The hope lies in the transformation of the tree, in the god's acknowledgement of the lover's devotion, in the family's reconciliation, in the fact that we're still telling this story millennia later. Pyramus and Thisbe may have died young, may have never had the chance to build the life together that they dreamed of. But their love did matter. It changed things. It transformed the physical world through the tree, and it transformed the social world through their family's reconciliation. Their story reminds us that even when individual lives end in tragedy, love itself persists. It continues in memory, in story, in the changes it makes to the world and the people it touches. Every telling of Pyramus and Thisbe's story is an affirmation that their love was real and significant, that their sacrifice was not entirely in vain, that their brief time together and their manner of dying meant something beyond just personal tragedy. And perhaps that's the deepest truth the story offers, that love has the power to transcend even death, not through supernatural resurrection or reunion in an afterlife, but through its impact on the world and on other people. The families were forever changed by Pyramus and Thisbe's love and loss. The mulberry tree was forever changed. Every person who has read or heard their story has been changed in some small way, prompted to think about love and sacrifice, family and obligation, communication and tragedy. In this way, Pyramus and Thisbe achieved a kind of immortality that would have been impossible if they had lived quiet, conventional lives, married other people their families approved of, and faded into forgotten history. Their tragedy became their monument, and that monument has stood for over 2,000 years, inspiring, warning, moving, and challenging everyone who encounters it. Closing reflections. So we come to the end of our journey through this ancient and powerful story. We've walked with Pyramus and Thisbe from their childhood homes separated by a wall, through their discovery of love through a crack in that wall, through their desperate plan to escape and be together, and finally to their tragic deaths beneath the mulberry tree. We've seen how their blood transformed that tree from white to dark red, how their families were united in grief, and how their story has echoed through literature and culture for more than 2 millennia. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of ancient Babylon, of its legendary walls rising against the desert sky. Perhaps you'll see a young man and woman whispering through a crack in a wall, their love growing despite every obstacle placed before them. Perhaps you'll see a mulberry tree with dark red berries, each one carrying the memory of sacrifice and devotion that changed the very fabric of the natural world. The story of Pyramus and Thisbe reminds us that love is always a risk, always a leap into uncertainty, always a choice to make ourselves vulnerable to another person in ways that can lead to either transcendent joy or devastating pain. It reminds us that miscommunication and hasty assumptions can have terrible consequences, that pride and old grudges are poor reasons to deny happiness to those we love, and that the intensity of young love, while often dismissed as immature or foolish, is actually something profound and powerful that deserves to be taken seriously. Most of all, it reminds us that some stories of love and loss, of sacrifice and transformation, are too important to be forgotten, too true to human experience to ever become irrelevant. As long as people fall in love, face obstacles to that love, and sometimes make tragic choices in the name of that love, the story of Pyramus and Thisbe will continue to resonate, to move, to teach, and to inspire. The mulberry tree still stands, at least in our imaginations and in the collective memory of human culture. Its dark berries still proclaim to all who see them that love is powerful enough to change the world, that devotion is real, and that even tragedy can become beauty when it is transformed into story and symbol. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of mythology's most enduring love stories, please consider subscribing to Myths of the Night for more explorations of ancient tales and their modern meanings. Share this video with anyone who appreciates stories of love and loss, and leave a comment about your thoughts on Pyramus and Thisbe's story. Would you have made the same choices they did? Do you see their actions as romantic or tragic? Do you believe their love was worth the price they paid? Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that every great love story, whether it ends in joy or sorrow, adds something irreplaceable to the great human story that we're all part of. Good night.